also plays an important role in ME/CFS, and the hypoperfusion actually can explain many symptoms we have in ME/CFS, and we know that at least early in the disease, inflammation does play a role as well, and in ME/CFS, in a subset, the disease is triggered by EBV. So here I listed the evidence we have for autoimmunity in post-infectious ME/CFS and in a subset of post-COVID patients. And to briefly summarize this, we have clear evidence of increased number of family or relatives in ME/CFS suffering from autoimmune disease. We have comorbidity of autoimmune diseases, frequently Hashimoto thyroiditis, which we've learned is true in post-COVID syndrome too. And we know that there are potential auto or mimicry sequences in EBV and also in the spike. And we know that EBV is a frequent trigger of ME/CFS and probably a co-trigger in post-COVID syndrome. In ME/CFS, we have evidence for various genetic risk factors, including HLA-DR molecules. We do have evidence for immunological risk factors. I want to mention the MBL deficiency, which we actually could find to be much more prevalent in post-COVID syndrome as well. And then I'm going to focus in a minute about the data we have for autoantibodies. Then alterations in memory B cells are described. And finally, we have a few studies providing first evidence for efficacy of autoantibody targeting treatments. So coming to autoantibodies, I want to draw your attention to a study in post-COVID patients analyzing anti-nuclear antibodies. And here one of the most interesting findings is that levels of antibodies to ribonuclein proteins and to the Sjögren syndrome antigens do correlate with the level of fatigue or the presence of fatigue 12 months after COVID. And this is a summary from a trial published from my neurological colleagues at Charité, and they analyzed patients with post-COVID with severe neurocognitive impairment. And what they could show is that several of them do have antibodies against known neurological antigens, but also against unknown neurological antigens. They analyzed these by immunofluorescence on mouse brain sections, and the presence of these antibodies correlated with the severity of cognitive impairment. And finally, I want to focus on several studies which described that autoantibodies against renin-angiotensin system proteins are triggered in COVID and found in post-COVID patient, and these are antibodies to ACE2, to ANG2, and to angiotensin 1, which may result in various dysregulations. And this study analyzed autoantibodies in patients with severe COVID, and what they could show is that these antibodies are probably functional. So antibodies against angiotensin 2 correlate with increased blood pressure. Here are these antibodies in COVID versus controls, and in those with high blood pressure, these antibodies were higher than in those without. And an interesting side study in this paper is that such antibodies could also be induced in mice by SARS-CoV-2 vaccination. And just briefly mentioning another study in acute COVID showing that antibodies to the angiotensin receptor 1 are strongly associated with disease severity. So coming to the G protein coupled receptor autoantibodies, and these antibodies have been studied in ME/CFS for more a decade. These are a little bit complicated antibodies because they are so-called natural autoantibodies. So we all do have these antibodies, and they play a role in activating of various receptors. And what we've know is that autoantibodies to these receptors correlate with symptom severity in various diseases. And in ME/CFS, we have learned that levels of especially autoantibodies to autonomic nervous system receptors, and this is true for beta-adrenergic and muscarinic receptors, do correlate not only with symptom severity, but also with statin S alterations. And we have preliminary data that this antibody function is impaired in ME/CFS. And I do not have the time to go into more detail, but I just want to make the point, and these are two papers which are published from my group, is that levels of these antibodies to adrenergic and cholinergic receptors, but also to angiotensin receptors, do correlate with the severity of fatigue in those patients who suffer from post-infectious ME/CFS. Interestingly, not a control group who developed ME/CFS following other triggers indicated by gray, and ME/CFS are the black and striped bars. And interestingly, a similar finding we could get from analyzing these antibody levels in post-COVID ME/CFS patients. And again, we found correlations of several of these autoantibodies with the severity of fatigue, but not in this group of post-COVID patients not fulfilling the ME/CFS criteria. And one final finding from this study is that I find very interesting is that the hypoperfusion of the fingers, so-called Raynaud's syndrome, does correlate well with elevated levels of beta-2-adrenergic receptor antibodies as well. So coming in the last minute to the final point, we do have few clinical trials targeting autoantibodies in ME/CFS and in post-COVID syndrome. We did a few small trials with immunoabsorption, that's a technique with which you can wash out all antibodies, including autoantibodies, and we have first evidence, and that is published, that this results in symptom improvement in patients with ME/CFS. That was done pre-pandemic, and we are currently doing a clinical trial in patients with ME/CFS triggered by COVID, and this is very preliminary data, an interim analysis of the first 10 patients showing that at least a subset of these patients rapidly improve in clinical symptoms, again assessed by SF-36, physical function after, well, this is 1 month after immunoabsorption. And this trial is part of clinical trial platform. We got funding in Germany to study various treatment approaches in post-COVID and ME/CFS, accompanied by a comprehensive biomarker and diagnostic set of studies. We have just published a paper summarizing our approach and the ongoing clinical trials in post-COVID and ME/CFS worldwide. And we just had a conference in Berlin. Antony Komarov and Peter Rowe gave a presentation as well. And these lectures are digitally recorded and are in English. So if you are interested in more detail, you can go to this site. So to summarize, I showed that a subset of post-COVID syndrome patients do suffer from ME/CFS. We have first evidence for a role of autoantibodies in these diseases. And I think treatment studies targeting autoantibodies are warranted based on this result, and that is to acknowledge my co-workers and funding